Today's lesson will be looking at the Paris Climate Agreement. The Paris Accord, which was agreed to in 2015, is the latest attempt by the international community to address the causes and effects of climate change. With the dire consequences of continued and accelerating climate change understood by world leaders and scientists, many have argued that this agreement is our best chance to deal with a warming planet before it's too late. And in this lesson, we'll be answering the following questions. First, what is the Paris Climate Agreement? Second, what is the historical background of the Paris Climate Agreement? Third, what are some of the specific targets of the Paris Climate Agreement? And finally, what are some of the limitations of the Paris Climate Agreement? So to begin, we want to learn exactly what the Paris Climate Agreement is all about. Well, the Paris Climate Agreement was agreed to at the Paris Climate Conference in December 2015. And at that conference, 196 countries adopted the climate deal. The agreement sets out a global action plan to put the world on track to avoid dangerous and catastrophic climate change by limiting global warming to 2 degrees Celsius over the next century. And the agreement is due to enter into full force in 2020. So though it was signed in 2015, the actual processes do not go into effect until 2020. And so here we have a map showing the parties and signatories to the agreement. The countries in orange have both signed and formally ratified the agreement, while countries in green have signed but have not yet formally ratified the agreement. So their governments have not taken the extra step of actually formally ratifying it. However, they plan to do so in the near future. As of May 2018, the only country that has not yet signed the agreement is Vatican City. And the only reason they have not done so is because they are not a full member of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, meaning they can't formally do it at this point. But however, they plan to try to become a full member as soon as possible so that they can formally sign on to this agreement. There were a couple of countries at the initial agreement that didn't sign on. One was Nicaragua. The reason they didn't sign on is because they didn't think this agreement went far enough. However, they have since signed. So right now we only have Vatican City that hasn't signed, and they want to sign on to this agreement. So this is definitely an example of the global community coming together, and this is as unilateral as we could make in an agreement. Literally almost every country has agreed to this. Now, some specific targets that governments agreed to include a long-term goal of keeping the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius. And in addition, they want to aim to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, since this would significantly reduce risks and the impacts of climate change. So although the long-term goal is no more than 2 degrees Celsius, their best practice is to limit this to 1.5 if at all possible. Governments also agreed on the need for global emissions to peak as soon as possible, recognizing that this will take longer for developing countries, and they want to undertake rapid reductions thereafter in accordance with the best available science. So again, we've had increases in carbon being pumped into the atmosphere since the start of the Industrial Revolution for the past 200 years. That's continued to go up year over year. What this means is that we want that to peak as soon as possible and then immediately afterwards have it rapidly reduce. And parties will also have to formulate long-term goals for low emission strategies by 2020. So by 2020, they have to have these long-term goals that will take them out to the year 2050. Now, in the agreement, many intergovernmental bodies, such as the EU, have taken the lead on implementing measures to achieve the goals, which include emissions reductions, adaptation, loss and damage, and building capacity and technology. Now, the Paris Agreement did not happen in a vacuum. In fact, it was the culmination of 2 decades of negotiations and agreements. So we can trace back these climate negotiations all the way back to 1992 when we had the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro. That was sort of our first attempt to get on track to come up with some kind of global agreement on what to do about the climate. This led into the Kyoto Protocol, which was signed in 1997. This was the first real comprehensive attempt to come to a global climate agreement. However, the deal was non-binding and had no mechanism to punish countries for withdrawing. So even though it was sort of our first attempt at doing this to limit emissions and to try to take a shot at ending global warming and reversing it, there wasn't a mechanism for enforcing any of these things. Countries started to pull out of it, and perhaps the biggest strike against it of it all was that some powerful countries, including the United States, never ratified the agreement to begin with. So after Kyoto, since we can see it as a failure, it did not last. Further negotiations looked for common ground, and other major conferences in 2009 in Copenhagen, in 2011 in Dublin, helped set the stage for the Paris Climate Conference, which happened in 2015 and where this agreement happened. So what does the agreement hope to accomplish? Well, this graph is sort of showing what it's trying to do. So what's happening on this graph, these different lines are predicting different predictions based on what policies we have in place. So the top line here, the baselines, that would be what would happen if we do nothing about climate change. We have no policies. We just kind of keep going with whatever. People are allowed to burn as much carbon as they want. What we would see based on these predictions is between 4.1 and 4.8 degrees of warming over the next century. And even a little bit of warming, that would have catastrophic effects. Every degree of Celsius comes with greater and greater consequences. 5 degrees of warming would be catastrophic for human civilization. If we were to continue to enact current policies, the ones before the Paris Agreement came into effect, we would see between 3.3 and 3.9 degrees Celsius of warming. And what we want to see, or what the agreement wants to see, is 2 degrees Celsius or lower. So what we can see here is sort of the different targets and what would happen depending on what policies we end up enacting. So how does the agreement work? So the structure of the agreement is sort of as follows. So each party has to do the following things. Each party shall prepare, communicate, and maintain contributions to the agreement. This happens 9 to 12 months before inscription with clear information. And all parties shall pursue domestic measures to achieve reductions. So these are binding contributions. What this means is that countries have to do this. They have to set their own targets. Developing countries are encouraged to move over time to economy-wide targets, and there's a green climate fund set up by wealthy countries to invest in environmental projects in developing countries. So these emissions reductions targets are targets that each country sets on their own. That's the only binding part of this agreement. You have to set targets. Whether or not you make those targets, there's no mechanism for enforcing that. And countries get to decide what their own targets are. Transparency and accountability. So governments here agree to come together every 5 years to set more ambitious targets as required by science, to report to each other and the public on how well they are doing to implement their targets, and to track progress towards the long-term goal through a robust transparency and accountability system. So again, here, this has to do with that goal setting. So each country has to set goals, and the idea here is every 5 years they need to come together and report on how they are going about achieving those goals. And if they need to set more ambitious targets based on science that's coming out, whether or not those targets are actually having an impact, we have to make them more strict. That's what this is talking about here. So it's communicating what's going on to the public. The agreement also includes a global stockade that is to be taken every 5 years to formally monitor the progress of specific targets. And we can see here sort of the schedule for this in 2018, 2023, and then 2028 and beyond. The agreement also seeks to look at losses and damages. So for regions for which the adoption of these targets will be too late to avert the consequences of climate change, they need some way of redressing the losses and damages from it. So the agreement's trying to help those countries that even 2 degrees of warming will still negatively impact them, although there's no enforcement mechanism included for doing so. So the idea here is that a country like Canada, where the catastrophic effects of climate change won't affect us as much as countries near the equator, where the effects might be worse, or small island countries. Now, this includes both short-term effects, so those like extreme weather events, and long-term effects. So, for example, the effects of rising sea levels and their effect on small island nations. There are many small Pacific island nations. Think places like Fiji, Kiribati, these small island countries that might completely disappear if sea levels continue to rise. Not just that they'll have to deal with flooded coastlines, literally the entire country might end up underwater. So this brings up the question of not only what happens to those people when sea levels rise, where do they go, what happens when their country is literally underwater, but also who pays for the damages of that? Who pays to make up for that. The idea of the agreement here is that countries are supposed to come together and help pay for those countries and help pay for those damages. But again, one criticism we could have is that there's no way of actually enforcing that. If a country decides they're not going to help, there's nothing to really do about that. And that brings us to some limitations of the Paris Agreement. So some scientists have argued that the agreement does not go far enough. They either argue that the targets are not enough to prevent 2 degrees of warming, or that 2 degrees of warming will have worse impacts than predicted. So either we're not doing enough to stop the warming, or that even if we do meet these targets and the world only warms another 2 degrees over the next century, that's still going to have catastrophic effects that are going to threaten us as a civilization. There's also limited enforcement mechanisms for countries that do not comply with this. Again, it's mostly non-binding. The only part of the agreement that is binding is that countries have to set their own targets. But there's nothing to say that a country needs to set ambitious targets, and if they don't meet those ambitious targets, that something will happen to them. You can set an ambitious target and fall short, and that's it. Or you can set maybe a not so ambitious target. There's really not a whole lot to punish a country that doesn't meet that. So, for example, one of France's targets is that they plan to get rid of fossil fuel powered cars over the next coming decades. There's nothing in this agreement to say that if they don't meet that there will be a financial penalty on them. So it's mostly non-binding. Another main setback to the agreement was the withdrawal of the United States, or at least the intention to withdraw that was announced by President Donald Trump in June 2017. However, the agreement does not come into effect until 2020, and the U.S. cannot formally pull out of the agreement until November 2020. And for anyone that follows American politics, November 2020 is the date of the next U.S. presidential election. So you can bet that this will probably be a pretty big topic in that race if Donald Trump is running again, or even if he's not, if there's another Republican running in his place. This will probably be a big topic, what the U.S. should do in regards to the Paris Climate Agreement. Should they continue their intention to pull out, or should they stay in? So in summary, in this lesson you learned that the Paris Climate Agreement is an agreement signed by almost all countries of the world that seeks to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and deal with the effects of climate change. The agreement contains specific goals, including limiting warming to no more than 2 degrees Celsius over the next century, but countries are allowed to set their own targets for how they plan to achieve the goals. Some criticize the agreement for not doing enough to prevent catastrophic climate change, while others point to limited enforcement mechanisms and the withdrawal of the United States as a major obstacle to the agreement's success.